just because you're seeing a TSH that's low or even suppressed does not mean that you are hypothyroid.
Who needs thyroid supplementation versus who could benefit from thyroid supplementation?
They found that mothers with 2 children had substantially lower brominated flame retardants in their bodies compared to women who hadn't had children, which suggests that it's actually being passed on into the offspring.
I think you would agree with that. You always want to get someone's diet and exercise and lifestyle aligned before administering a thyroid supplementation. Welcome back to Recommended Daily Value. I'm your host, Tyler Woodward, and today I've had the pleasure of bringing on PhD candidate Keith Littlewood to talk about everything thyroid supplementation. You can expect to learn about the epidemic of hypothyroidism facing our society today, who needs thyroid supplementation versus who could use thyroid supplementation, the failure of thyroid tests and tests to use instead, various types of thyroid supplementation and the differences between them, how to prepare for starting thyroid supplementation, biomarkers to look out for and symptoms to watch for, and if you will need to use thyroid supplementation indefinitely once you start, and lastly, the dosing timing ratio of T3 to T4, as well as any additional cofactors that you might need to increase your intake of in order to meet your increased metabolic rate. It was an awesome episode, and I really hope you guys enjoy. Awesome. Keith Littlewood, how you doing today?
Not too bad. It's nice and cold here.
Yes, sir. But that means snowboarding season, so that's always good. So awesome. Today we're going to go over thyroid supplementation and kind of everything you need to know when considering thyroid supplementation. Obviously, this is not medical advice. This is two friendly gentlemen having a conversation about the potential uses of thyroid in theoretical practicality. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of the thyroid. And the thyroid is basically this butterfly-shaped gland that sits right beneath your Adam's apple if you're a man, and where your Adam's apple would be if you were a woman. And it basically emits 3 hormones, or 2 hormones primarily, will be T3 and T4. T3 is the active form of thyroid hormone that really enters the cell and gets the cells churning, so it regulates how much oxygen the cells consume. And T4 usually needs to be converted to T3 in the liver, but T4 is the main export of the thyroid, and it goes systemically throughout circulation. It also emits, I believe, T1 and T2, which are lesser known functions of the thyroid hormone. And then you also have RT3, which is reverse T3, and it tells the body to decrease its thyroid synthesis and decrease thyroid function. And then TSH, which is the back way neuro pathway for the brain to tell the body to increase thyroid hormone production. How are we tracking there, Keith? All right, cool. All right, so one of the first things I want to address is the epidemic of hypothyroidism today. They say about 1 in 10 people are probably hypothyroidism, but what do you think it is in actuality with everything that we're exposed to, if you had to give a ballpark estimate?
So yeah, the figures that you tend to see around about anywhere from 2%, sometimes 5%. In India, there's an overall kind of prevalence of about 11%, and the suggestion behind that is endocrine disruptors. I think if you look at it realistically and you look at, say, entertained subclinical hypothyroidism, I think you're getting a decent figure of 10 to 20%, and possibly even more, bearing in mind that the gold standard of how it's assessed, TSH with T4. Depending on who you talk to, if you're an endocrinologist or medical doctor, that's the gold standard. I think when you dig into it a little bit deeper and see all of the mechanisms of function that can make TSH output and the sensing of negative feedback problematic, then you kind of could get a better idea that there's certainly more. So it becomes difficult to put a figure on it, but my feeling is somewhere between 10 to 20% of the world's population, possibly even more. The more that we start seeing increased stressors, increased endocrine disruption, I think that's probably likely to be, getting higher. And also, when you start altering TSH set points, which can happen during the gestational period, depending on what the offspring or fetus is being exposed to, you're kind of getting a whole lot of problems there. So I think it's increasing. I think you just have to look at the increases in other diseases like cancer, hypercholesterolemia, hyperglycemia, metabolic syndrome, instead of just kind of looping these in and saying, oh, these individual diseases. It's probably a reflection of the increasing low thyroid that we tend to be seeing. And certainly within my practice, you tend to see a lot of people. We know that we can change a lot with food. Some people can be presenting as low thyroid. People can have issues in winter, which could be low thyroid. Again, it could be, a light deficiency. There could be many things. But I think the more that we're seeing broad spread, creeping in of chemicals within the food chain, within the water, within the air that we breathe, potentially electromagnetic stresses. This could be increasing it and making it harder to detect.
Absolutely. And so the emphasis of that is that it's probably drastically underdiagnosed compared to what the medical literature says.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, so how would you define subclinical hypothyroidism?
Well, again, in the textbook, it's usually just an elevated TSH, which would usually be somewhere above the, I think the general markers is about 4.5 to 5 MULs is the measurement. Usually the reference range is somewhere around about 0.5 to 4.5 or 5. Subclinical hypothyroidism is an elevated TSH above that, with usually a normal or low T4. And again, I think that becomes problematic when we're looking at that as well. And as many kind of older researchers looked at and who kind of paid the price, is that it can take a long time for the TSH to creep up. And as we know, there can be certainly many confounding factors that make the TSH look problematic, whether it's, you go into the doctors and you're kind of having your TSH assessed, but if they're not checking how much you're eating, for example, how much stress you're under, how much exercise you're doing relative to nutrition intake, then that TSH is going to be problematic, because we know that fasting and malnutrition decreases TSH output and can render you hypothyroid without actually being able to diagnose it properly. So these are the things that I think you need to consider. Sorry, but going back to subclinical hypothyroidism, again, that is generally the marker, is an elevated TSH, mildly elevated TSH. And I think that's when you would start to look at other indicators that might give you, an idea, and they can come out in cholesterol values, in a CBC. Certainly the cruder evaluation of temperature and pulse would be a good thing to look at. There are potentially other markers in there, hypertension, hyperglycemia, that could be looked at as part of that, and even other things beyond that, such as liver enzymes or other factors that you could look at there. But it's not always set in stone. It's not a linear picture. You don't see all these magic buttons going off, going high cholesterol, hyperglycemia, hypertension, all the things at once. It can be depending on the output, where the disturbance is, and this is why my particular belief, and what I'm really challenging with the research, is the idea that if you don't understand where the blockage is occurring, which could be disruption of the carrier proteins, such as thyroid binding globulin, transthyretin, human serum albumin, which all can be hijacked by a variety of pollutants. And then you have the transmembrane transporters, which are your monocarboxylate transporters, 8, 10, your OAT1, PC1s. These are kind of your specific transporters that would take thyroid across into the cell, where the deodonases will work. And if the deodonases are disrupted, and then specifically with certain chemicals, how they bind to the thyroid receptor, which can give you an agonist or antagonistic response, depend on how the binding forces work within the DNA binding domain and the ligand binding, how that all kind of interacts together. So if you're not aware of all those things, and you just think TSH, negative feedback, then you're kind of blinkered to the idea of how the thyroidal system works, because it's vast and it can be disturbed at many different levels.
Yeah. In other words, to try and simplify that for the listener, that would basically be saying that TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, goes up as thyroid production goes down, so it's trying to increase thyroid production. But there's a bajillion different things that can get in the way of the thyroid actually making it, or being produced in the first place in the thyroid, or getting it to the cell, getting it in the carriers. And a lot of those are endocrine disruptors that we're being exposed to in our environment, among other things like, as you said, potentially EMF, like Wi-Fi and cell phone, and even your couch covering, whereas brominated fire retardants.
Yeah, the brominated flame retardants, which are the most common. Well, they're one of the most common findings in household dust. And if you look, there's some studies of kind of applications of these and findings within certain. I think Melbourne, there was a really interesting one that suggested potentially up to 17 milligrams, 20 milligrams of brominated flame retardants could be ingested and breathed in yearly. That's quite a lot of in fact, I think it was 17 grams, because it was 17,000 milligrams. Yeah, so it was up to 15, 17, 20 grams could be ingested throughout the year. some of these are lipophilic as well, so they get stored in fats. There's a really interesting study that compared in China. Now, China, that tends to be a lot higher in some of the kind of production areas, but even in somewhere like Beijing, they found that mothers with 2 children had substantially lower brominated flame retardants in their bodies compared to women who hadn't had children, which suggests that it's actually being passed on into the offspring. So that, I mean, even if you just consider that, there will be another pathway of ingestion for offspring. And obviously children and kind of toddlers, babies, they will have a higher rate because they get a higher load. What the specific point is that we stop dealing with these effectively, and they become obesogens because we start storing them as we create more fat to store away from tissues. It's really hard to find out, and that's why potentially we can look at how we can modulate thyroid to stop these effects. Can you take more thyroid? Can it disrupt the effect of the endocrine or specifically thyroid disrupting chemicals? And in some cases it can. And there are studies in, tadpoles and other amphibians where, metamorphosis has been disrupted, but when you apply T3, the growth vector starts again. So and in humans, that's where it gets more complicated, because we've looked at treating people simply with just T4, assuming that conversion is always going to take place from T4 to T3. But again, you could have specific disruptions from the deodenase enzymes, the things that convert T4 to T3, your outer and inner ring deodenases. It could be again, something that's going on at the receptor and the cellular function as well. So this is where it becomes harder to kind of understand what's actually going on. But I think there are some simple strategies that people can experiment with as they go about their kind of journey.
Absolutely. And, with everything that we're exposed to today, almost everything is affecting our thyroid in some shape or form. So we need to do all the things we can, basically, to at least give our thyroid some functionality, protecting ourselves from certain things and maybe using some exogenous supplementation. And that could just be a B vitamin complex or eating beneficial foods and getting outside. But we need to probably be taking proactive steps to making sure our thyroid health is on point. Who needs thyroid supplementation versus who could benefit from thyroid supplementation, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I think there's a specific subset of people with fatigue. I think there's a group of people that kind of really don't do very well in winter, who go into subclinical hypothyroidism and then might get better as the temperatures increase. I think these people should be considering why thyroid might be a factor. I mean, you can obviously do the test of temperature and pulse evaluation, which I think is a great way. There can be other factors that affect those, of course. That need to be considered. But I think I used to think it was everybody who was constipated, didn't sleep, and whose hair was falling out. But again, there can be other things going on that could be driving that. There's much we can do with nutrition to get someone's thyroid functioning as well. People who are on low protein diets could be a factor because they're not consuming thyroid from tissues. If you think about that, the cells contain probably 2/3 of the available thyroid hormone in the body, and the rest is in the serum. Potentially if you're not eating meat, but then you could argue that just comes down to a protein issue. But again, if it's the protein issue that's holding on to the thyroid, that might be an issue to consider. So if you're feeling cold, if you're kind of feeling slow, your movement's compromised, issues with menstrual cycle, even kind of low testosterone in guys, there are people who respond very, very well to thyroid hormone. And I think we always start with a foundation of good nutrition for that to work. It's like taking anything. We expect sometimes magic bullets to occur from taking one thing. It always kind of frustrates me when you see doctors or endocrinologists say that nutrition has nothing to do with the hormones. It's like, well, you only have to look at a few basic studies to get an idea that that's a complete misnomer. It doesn't really take too much research to understand that nutrition can have a huge interplay with thyroid, whether it's the cofactors, whether it's magnesium, selenium, zinc, whether it's kind of adequate calorie intake, whether it's adequate protein intake, adequate vitamin A and retinol. All of these factors play into thyroid. So I think it's all of those people and above, and many other things like perhaps people struggling to get pregnant or have fertility issues. These are all considerations that should be looked at, and again, not just going back to the kind of standard TSH and T4. T3 can be helpful, and whether you look at T4 in free forms or total forms, I think the totals are just as valid as the free forms because they correlate really, really well, and it's good backup when you kind of seeing things not making as much sense. So, for example, with T3, that is the body's priority is to defend T3 values. That's what it'll always do. So you'll always see some changes in T3. And if somebody's coming in and their blood test is like lower 50 percentile, or if it's getting towards lower 20 percentile, ideally I'd want to see those T3 values up in the upper 20 percentile of the reference ranges, depending on where you are, because I think having the high T3 values is where the body likes to be. And again, we can't always rely on the TSH and the T4 to provide that. So, looking at those things and understanding if you have low energy, fatigue, brain fog, disturbed sleep, there is a subset of people who kind of sleep fatigued all the time, who have kind of relatively overt low thyroid function, will be fatigued all the time. But you can still get sleep disturbances because of that. Now, usually when the thyroid is kind of disturbed as well, you tend to get some convergence of other issues. So you might get decreased motility and digestion issues, which would show up as constipation, which might have, increased inflammation in the bowel, which would add on to the sleep disturbances. So I think all of these things can play into it. I don't think there's a specific function that you could say isn't relevant, because there can be many things. But again, it's trying to unravel where the particular stress is for someone, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And so I think you would agree with that. You always want to get someone's diet and, exercise and lifestyle aligned before administering a thyroid supplementation, or at least most of the time. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a game changer. There's no point, taking T3 on an empty stomach and not eating for an hour or two, because obviously that's going to ramp up your metabolic rate. And if you haven't got enough energy, you're going to perpetuate gluconeogenesis, trying to break down fats and proteins as a fuel, because you don't have enough carbohydrate available. The thyroid will work much better when there's available carbohydrate, and that's why you see so many people who kind of develop thyroid issues or kind of quasi-thyroid issues by being on a kind of carnivore diet, a low carb diet generally. I don't think it's a good place to be when you're expecting to kind of ramp up, thyroid function just by taking a thyroid supplement, and bearing in mind that how often you do that will increase the amount of lipid peroxidation that's going on, because you're constantly breaking down fatty acids, and with that becomes damage that can occur over a period of time. So again, it comes down to your metabolic flexibility to the success that you get with that. But again, taking thyroid and thinking that everything is going to be okay is a knife edge to kind of tread on.
Yeah, I completely agree. What do you think are the biggest mistakes you see across people that start supplementing with thyroid?
Often going too much too soon. I think it's very prudent to start with a low dose, whether it's kind of a combo of a T4, T3, or going in just with a T3. And I think T3 on its own can suit a lot of people really, really well. Some people do better on combos, and rarely some people do okay on levothyroxine on its own. So I think jumping in with that straight away, always take time to develop, your kind of, remember you're kind of giving back something to the body that it hasn't had for some time. So you can be easy to kind of push yourself over the edge. But if you kind of, start with food is a good place to go. Sometimes if you have, assimilation issues, digestion issues, you can think about having on its own, but eating relatively quickly after that. A lot of thyroid supplements will dissolve under the tongue really, really well anyway. Your Cynoplus and Cynomel dissolve pretty well, and you'll absorb a substantial amount sublingually or under the tongue. So it's about finding the kind of the brand and the application that works for you, to be honest. In most cases, I wouldn't say there's anything that's set in stone, because some people can need it before eating, some people do better with eating, and then just kind of using it throughout the day and apply as needed. Using the temperature and pulse is often key for a lot of people. So for example, if you're if you go to an endo, you'll be giving a dose of, say, levothyroxine or something like that. Some using more compounded or combos of T4, T3. But again, it's come back and see me in 6 weeks' time, right? And there's a huge vast things that can happen in that time frame. So again, if you use your kind of own tools of assessment, I don't think you can go too far wrong. And again, coming back to the temperature and pulse test, I think is a really great idea. Now, obviously, most of the fear-mongering about thyroid is pushing people towards hyperthyroidism. I've seen that with a few kind of naturopaths, people who come to me from naturopaths, and even just standard medical doctors. Just because you're seeing a TSH that's low or even suppressed does not mean that you are hypothyroid. It does not mean that you are leaching calcium from bones. It does not mean that you're pushing yourself towards atrial fibrillation and dysrhythmias. Just because you have thyroid a TSH that's suppressed, and some people will actually look for that. If you think about it, it's pituitary output that you're suppressing, which means you're taking enough thyroid hormone that the negative feedback is kind of, it's nullified, saying I don't need to produce anymore because here we have the right amount of thyroid hormone that's being uptaken. And so TSH that's low or undetectable is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, the things that you would add on to that is that if your heart rate is going up and it's constantly above 90 beats a minute chronically, and I'm talking your higher 90s, hundreds, some people do really well about that 85, 90 beats per minute. Some people do well within that range of 70 to 85 beats per minute. It's looking at that and looking at the symptoms that you might be getting. Are you irritable? Are you kind of really, really hot? Are you kind of needing to eat all day long to kind of satisfy what the thyroid is doing? It's like, this is when you're hyperthyroid. You tend to be prone to losing weight very, very easily. So I would not ignore people, but you need to kind of weigh it up. Just because your TSH is suppressed doesn't mean you're hyperthyroid. So they would be the tools that I would suggest to make the decision yourself. So if you can get to that, again, you can look at T4 and T3 values. Are they going above the reference ranges? Reverse T3, I'm not so worried about these days, but certainly if it's chronically over the reference range or upper reference range and beyond that, then you might be suggesting, combined with the temperature and the pulse, if the temperature's going up, well above 37 degrees, then you might be suggesting, hey, you might be taking too much thyroid hormone. But a lot of people will suggest that and it's based upon the idea that thyroid is dangerous. And it is to someone that's probably at acute risk of having a heart attack within that week, and they're going to take too much thyroid hormone all at once. And that's why if you start on a relatively low dose, say T3, for example, at 6.5 micrograms and build up over a few weeks, you're going to avoid anything like that. But I would say, use those tools to kind of get a better idea of where you're at, rather than kind of, just relying on someone every 6 weeks. The idea is to kind of, you understand how the thyroid operates. You have the tools at your hand to kind of understand where the best doses are. And ultimately you can control where you're at and what you need, rather than kind of, you see so many people that have had their thyroid dosing drop down because their TSH has gone low, below 0.5 or undetectable, but yet they feel really good. And as soon as they get taken off that thyroid dose again, I feel really crap. But my doctor's told me I'm going to have a heart attack, or I'm going to have osteoporosis, which is like, it's just such a myopic approach to take.
That makes sense. So one of the things that you mentioned is that obviously the thyroid, or taking thyroid, is going to boost your metabolism. So you're probably going to eat more food. Do you see, and among other nutrients, your nutrient requirements are going to go up. Do you see people running into these roadblocks where they start taking thyroid and then all of a sudden they feel worse because, let's say, they need more B1 or protein or something along that?
Yeah, occasionally. I think if you're kind of ticking all the boxes, even if you're kind of going on a philosophy of 3 square meals a day, or eating the snacks as needed, that's generally avoided, because a good diet that's kind of good quality dairy, good quality protein, adequate carbs will have all of those things in it. Sure, and I think this becomes some interplay between, you talked about thiamine, for example. If you're going hyperthyroid, or you're going to a very high metabolic rate, your thiamine need will increase. Right, because that you need more B1 to processed carbohydrates within the electron transport chain, so you can process that energy and it goes through the complexes. So that can be a factor. I've seen it in a couple of people. It's not something I see a lot of, but I think it's something to consider. But again, if you're kind of ticking all the boxes of nutrition, it can be a factor in some, but generally not much. My bias is that you tend to see is that when thyroid, I feel best when I take minimal supplements and I've got my thyroid dose spot on. And generally when I start playing around with some of my own nutrition supplements and trying to find different things, and I tend to push myself over. But I found that just getting my thyroid right, my mineral intake is well balanced, my ability to use those minerals and cofactors seems to be spot on. And so I would say for a lot of people that when you get your thyroid working, just maintaining a good quality diet is where most of the benefits can come. There can be a lot of supplements that can help that to get there, but I think with some, that's where you want to stop and come off them and see how good you feel.
Okay. Are there any dangers to thyroid supplementation in terms of, you've been using thyroid supplementation for, let's say, 6 months, and maybe you want to try coming off of it for whatever reason? Like, what could there be any side effects, or is there any that you are starting to rely on thyroid?
Well, the dogma is that the thyroid stops producing thyroid hormone. I'm working with someone at the moment who I did a consult with last week who had thyroid storm because she actually had an operation. She had been on thyroid for 10 years, and then post-operation, the thyroid supplement that she was on had pushed her over into hypothyroidism, but she'd been hypo all this time. So there's something related to the operation that she had that actually caused her thyroid output to increase substantially. So she had to stop the thyroid hormone because she went totally hyper. So the idea that your body doesn't produce its own thyroid hormone after you've been taking it for some time is erroneous. And there will be many people that probably keep it suppressed. And that's why if you take the approach of just titrating down slowly, over months, rather than, so if you're on a couple of grains of thyroid, you take a couple of months to kind of titrate down rather than stopping, because that's where your body is going to perceive it as a threat. It's going to ramp up production. If there's not enough cofactors, nutrition factors, and you're in relatively stressful, polluted environments, this is where you potentially could increase factors like thyroid nodules or goiters, or that's quite possible that could occur. But again, if you take a very slow, methodical approach to decreasing it down, there's no reason why you can't come off it and get the body start producing again. So, and I'd actively encourage people to do that.
In your practice, do you see any difference between, Cynomel and Cynomax, like the literal hormones, the synthetic hormones, versus the desiccated thyroid?
No, and I used to be a big proponent of NDT over anything else, but I've just found that Cynomel and Cynoplus do pretty good jobs. I've seen clients do really well on the other synthetic forms, whether it's Idea Labs or other versions. Some people do really well on glandulars. Some people just do not get the bang for their buck from glandulars. So again, it becomes a bit of a suck it and seeing what works best for a lot of people.
And do you have people that will try the desiccated thyroid extract and see nothing but go over to Cynomel or Idea Labs and see great results too?
No, I think people can get an idea on those. I mean, the NDT, for example, is just as good as the other stuff. I think it just becomes a personal preference, and some people will do better. I've seen people do better on synthetic. I've seen people do better on NDT. So it really just depends on the person. And sometimes you can go through various production issues with various different brands, which I've seen throughout the years, that can render them useless for a while. So then people would end up making a switch, and it's usually because there's been a glitch in the production or something like that.
Okay. Then, so let's say I'm trying to start thyroid supplementation. What would you recommend? Let's say I have my diet somewhat on point. Obviously, there are always minuscule changes that can be made to optimize it a little bit more. But what are the big things that you're looking for to start tracking so you can see how the thyroid is affecting you, but also, maybe symptoms or things that you're looking out for, positive or negative?
Yeah, I think that the temperature and pulse is a good place to start with that. And I said using that reference range of perhaps 70 to 85, maybe upwards to 90, that can be quite useful. I think you've got to be looking for all of the key markers that I've kind of discussed before, which is, energy, digestion, ability to process stresses, of whether you see them as big or insignificant, or whether you can just, deal with them in a calm kind of balanced manner. Sleep is a big thing. So you're getting to sleep without too much issues. You're staying asleep, not waking up to pee at night, which again could be just simply from drinking too much water, as you tend to see with a lot of people. But these things, sleep is sustained. You're having 2 to 3 good bowel movements a day. Your energy is good. You're kind of processing stimuli and kind of dealing with problems. No brain fog, this kind of stuff, healthy libido. I think all of these are adequate markers that we should be kind of utilizing to say, well, I've got my thyroid dose right. And to the extent that they don't, could be thyroid, could be something else as well. Also, as well, one other thing is we often think that, we kind of process or we're working on something. So, so as a part of a process of getting people healthy, you think that you've got to a point when you are healthy. People do get sick again, not sick, but there are stresses that people deal with on a daily basis. I mean, we've just got chickens and guinea pigs at the moment. It's like, the potential for getting an infection if you don't wash your hands and stuff. There are many things going on. So the things will be thrown at people. Just because someone's thyroid is restored doesn't mean that you're not going to be exposed to kind of pathogens or bacteria or stressors. And it's more the idea of, and I think this is one of the benefits of getting thyroid working efficiently, is that you're able to raise ideas of, think, perceive, think, act, is that when the thyroid is working, you can process these things all the time. And if you get something, you get a digestive disturbance, then you can think of, it could be any one of these things. And I haven't been doing those for a while. Let's tick them off and let's go through it. So it's the process of restoring function that allows you to deal with all the kind of, smaller things that come our way. But to the extent that someone's been low thyroid a long time, all these problems kind of mount up and cause further problems for people. So I think that's just something to consider as well.
Absolutely. And what do you typically see, or like what are the biggest changes that you see in yourself and your clients when you get it dialed in? Because I'm sure it takes some time to really titrate the right dose, where it being too, titrating up, but maybe even titrating down where you see that they went a little bit hyperthyroid.
Well, that can be resolved relatively quickly. I mean, you can change that within, a day or two. Yeah. If you've been hyper. It's not hard to bring that down just by, literally stopping if need be. I think the things, again, it just be trial and error when you're titrating down as well. Anyway, from coming off, you're just looking at those things as, is motility slowing down? Is sleep, becoming a problem? Becoming more stressed and more irritable? Or kind of even more kind of laissez-faire when the problems, you just can't be bothered to deal with them because you don't have the energy. So I think, look at all of those things are going to be relevant. And it is just, all the symptom checklists that you kind of manage to get rid of is just something you'll be looking at them reversed. Are they starting to creep back, for example?
So talking about titrating the doses, do you think, is Keith always at X dose and X dose is always the right amount for Keith? Or can it vary depending on, right now you're in your PhD, you've got 2 kids and 2 businesses to manage, but also maybe you're going into winter as well. Can the right dose for you vary with time and stresses and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, I've actually got 3, but that's pretty
3
more
businesses.
No kids. But it's, I think certainly seasonal stuff. Now I'm back in the UK. Obviously, I used to live abroad in the desert. I was exposed to a lot more things there, like mold poisoning, but I had sunshine all year round, so it was easier to manage stuff. So I just find that staying on a higher dose, I tend to find that I get the best out of myself. And I experiment between, a T4 and a T3, an extra T3 throughout the day. I would know if I would taking too much because my sleep gets disturbed pretty quickly. I'll have a kind of slight pounding heart and not being able to sleep, and I could be a bit irritable, but that's kind of few and far between. It doesn't happen very often. So yeah, I think it's generally well avoided. I don't take my temperature and pulse as much as I should do these days, but I kind of I see that so many all the time with clients, and it's one of those things that I generally go on perception of how I feel.
And then when you're experimenting on yourself with ratios of T3 and T4 and just maybe total amounts, are you basically just looking for, in terms of biomarkers, are you looking at temperature and pulse, but also just how you feel? How would you rank those?
Yeah, no, I rarely check in with temperature and pulse these days, just because I go on subjective feelings. And if I kind of feeling that there's something there, I'll kind of sit down, use my pulse oximeter, or take my pulse on that. But I generally look to look at how I feel, and feeling good, being energetic, rather than not wanting to do anything, and avoid issues. Like, I've had some pretty stressful stuff with the PhD stuff, feeling pretty incompetent and messing stuff up, which is part of the process. And the fact that I'm kind of bounding back to get back in the lab and do stuff, or the businesses can be quite challenging, and it's like it's having that energy, isn't it? Not giving up, and just kind of keep processing, keep on soldiering on, and getting stuff done, and getting them done well, rather than kind of just so that they're the subjective markers for me. Like I said, I will check in with temperature and pulse if I feel that something's not right. But generally, feeling warm extremities, good bowel movements, good sleep, good processing is where I'm at. And I'd encourage most people to have those kind of contextual, kind of nuanced ideas for themselves. It's like, it's great to look at some of these markers. When I work with clients, a lot of people say, I want to get some tests done before I come and see you. What do I need done? And I say, to be honest, none. Unless you really want to go and pay for them. It's like, we'll fall back on those if things don't go the way that we want them to. But I want you feeling good. I want the symptoms ameliorating. I want you to kind of be able to process stuff and work on stuff yourself. And the blood, I still work with people who come with me that have got dozens and dozens of tests and have spent literally tens of thousands of pounds or dollars. And I think that's where you start to get somewhat paralysis by analysis. You start to, myopically focus on certain biomarkers or certain values of whether it's B12 or copper, and it's like, sometimes when you just get the thyroid working, copper and ceruloplasmin, they end up sorting themselves out. B12 sorts itself out, digestion sorts itself out. You regulate thyroid efficiently. A lot of these kind of systemic issues, with kind of very myopic values, tend to sort themselves out as well.
Yeah, but for the beginner person, you'd probably recommend they still at least check in with their temperature and pulse, right? At least until they get used to it.
Always, yeah. Always temperature and pulse, because it's crude, it's effective, it's cheap. It doesn't cost you anything. It can be a bit dull to start off with when you're doing. And I always like to use mouth and armpit as well, so I can see if there's a discrepancy between the two. And so I always use those as a matter of course throughout the initial consultations, for sure.
What would that tell you if there was a discrepancy between the two?
Well, my theory and bias is that you tend to see lower temperatures in the armpit with people that have problems. Not always, but there's a certain amount of people that have that. And these are the people that you tend to see who are constipated. They have bradycardia, they're prone to injury. They certainly get cold extremities. And this is just reflective of the kind of lower metabolic rate within the trunk. Now, the brain is, and the head, the oral value, or whether you take the inner ear reading, it's going to be one of the last places that you see it being decreased, because obviously the brain uses a phenomenal amount of glucose, big energy producing structure, or energy eating structure, and producing as well. And so you'll tend to see that last. I've seen the odd things where people have lower temperatures in the head, and the body temperature is higher, and this, I think, sometimes can be where there's something going on with the energy production in the brain, but it can resolve with a certain few things. So I do think that the most common thing you tend to see is a mouth that's relatively good, or kind of round about there, but then the axilla or the armpit reading is substantially lower and correlating with kind of those low thyroid symptoms.
That's very interesting. So I want to play devil's advocate for a second and say, Keith, our ancestors, they didn't need thyroid. There was no Sinomel or Sinomax, and they got along just fine. You look at like Weston A. Price, they didn't have any arthritis because they were eating good diets. Like, what do you think is the response to that, or what is your response to that?
Well, I think it has kind of multiple kind of inputs really. One of the most obvious things, and I think Ray Peat alluded to this a long time ago, is that when you're not eating animals that aren't high in thyroid, then you're eating muscles that don't have as much. I mentioned earlier on that in humans, it appears that 2/3 of the available thyroid is actually intracellular. It's in the cell. It's occupying the receptor with the thyroid response element and kind of being bound within the cell. So that means the serum, a lot of blood these days tends to go out anyway. So when you eat your muscle meats and that's, if you're eating hypothyroid animals, then potentially you're going to be not consuming that, and potentially that could be one factor of many. The most obvious thing is that the environment that we live in is very stressful. The pollution is getting. We tend to think, the bigger. I mean, it's a contentious point how you see the environmental science and climate, and I understand that's a whole nother argument in itself. And I think the idea that there's excess pollution is probably the most relevant out of all of those, not the temperature increases or carbon dioxide increases, because there's separate discussions I know. But however, in the average home, there are potentially thousands of endocrine disruptors, whether it's in the house dust. Animals that we consume, and to the extent that there's extra fat within the animals or milk products, will have certain amounts of these chemicals in them. So the ingestion, the inhalation, even topical, and again, I look at a lot of the studies in China, they've shown that when they kind of wipe people's foreheads and skin, the amount of brominated flame retardants and other endocrine disruptors on the skin and topical absorption of these chemicals is a very valid pathway. And then you throw into it, you kind of, your average busy city with kind of, lots of diesel engines and petrols that you end up breathing in with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You look at other sources of pollution within the air and in the home as well, whether it's cleaning chemicals, whether it's kind of within the dishwasher, whether it's kind of your kind of average toilet cleaner or whatever. All of these things are relevant from an exposure and a load that just keeps increasing. And we know that a lot of these chemicals bioaccumulate. There are plenty of studies that show post-mortem values of kind of plastics, PCBs accumulating in older brains. Well, that might make sense, obviously, because the exposure from a young person to an older person. But however, you could also argue that the bioaccumulation within the brains that's also associated with dementia and Parkinson's patients post-mortem is substantially high. So is it another factor that these kind of pollutants are converging within the brain, associated with altered glucose metabolism, also suppress thyroid, also have the capacity to kick the key thyroid transporters? Bear in mind that transthyretin is the primary carrier of thyroid hormone within the human brain, and that's easily displaced from thyroid hormone, particularly T4, by these pollutants. So these pollutants can bioaccumulate in the brain. They can cause a central nervous system state of hypothyroidism. And, these are the factors that I think would contribute to the idea that hypothyroidism is potentially increasing. Obviously, vast amounts of hypothyroidism were present in Africa, which were iodine deficiency. So that's been going on for potentially tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 years, depending on in the kind of demographics, location, geography, where you're based. In China, there was a huge cretinism epidemic, which I think we're talking like tens of millions of cretins over a certain time, that was resolved with iodine supplementation. So it's been going on from an iodine deficiency perspective. Now, to the extent that we're seeing pathology, we know that a lack of thyroid hormone in the developmental stages, particularly in utero, if you get even very mild disturbances to the brain, you'll see very key structures in the cortex, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and other structures that are also very thyroid dependent. So if T3 is disturbed, you can get certainly central nervous system. If you then get mutations to certain genes that are associated with thyroid disruption, you're going to see a very poor phenotype of hypothyroidism with potentially a damaged brain. So it's worth noting that you can actually knock out thyroid hormone receptors in animals, and they they function really, really well. But if they're even mildly hypothyroid during this time, then you will get, very substantial rates of pathology that are associated with potentially, diabetes, with this is where the link becomes in between ADHD and other kind of cognitive disorders and brain disorders, because there's been mild disturbances of thyroid function. So you only have to see these diseases increasing, and the argument then might be, oh, we're detecting them much more. We have a much bigger telescope, so we're seeing these diseases, and it's right, fine, that can be a factor, but we can't just brush under the carpet that there's these increasing chemicals that are disturbing thyroid physiology during developmental processes that could be leading to brain disturbances and progression of diseases like diabetes and cardiac diseases as well, and potentially cancers as well. So it's I think there are many other factors to that as well, but obviously I feel like I'm going on a bit about that.
No worries. That was a great answer. And I could keep you here all day. I would love to keep talking to you, but I just have one last question for you. I know you've got to run. So dosing, like titrating up the dose and the timing and like the ratio of T3 to T4, like where do you start and how do you progress that up?
You could start. The typical thing with the thyroid is going. There are various ideas on how much T4 to T3 is being produced. I mean, thyroid gland is supposed to generally secrete 4 to 1 T4 to T3. I've seen studies that have suggested 10 to 1. I'm not sure how reliable some of those are, but if you think about a 4 to 1 dose, if you were starting on a T4 to T3 combo, so you could start on, it depends. I mean, you could start on something on a 4 to 1 ratio, but a very, very low dose. You could start on a single dose of T3 of 6.5 micrograms. That might be useful for some people. If you were to start on a T4 to T3 combo of 4 to 1, even something like 26 to 6.5. Sorry, if 6.5 micrograms, if it was like a compounded or like an NDT, going on a 4 to 1 at that minimal dose of 6.5 to 28 micrograms of T4 to T3, that might be too much for someone. Some people might do really well on it. So I would always start on a lower dose, depending how it's compounded, depending what the supplement is. But I think starting somewhere, some people can do that just fine. Again, it's really hard to give a succinct answer here, because I would start on the lowest dose possible and then just build up. So if it was someone just on T3, I'd start with 6.5 micrograms. If it was somebody who wanted T4, T3, you could start them on that. But again, that amount of T4 and T3 might be too much to start with. This would come back to then is how they're absorbing it. Do they need to take it before food or with food? So I would always start low. If you want to start on a T4 to T3, consider the 4 to 1 ratio. Bearing in mind, if it does rev you up a bit, you just drop back. So you could start low with something like 28 to 6.5 on the T4 to T3 as a starting point.
And let's say we have client Julie, or not client, but friend, and let's say you have them start on the lowest point. When are you having them take it? Does it matter? It's kind of just playing it. And when are you having them go with straight T3 or T4 and T3?
It depends. It just depends on the person.
But what are you looking for there?
Yeah, I just to see how they respond. Some people won't respond at all. And again, it might be that you need to go up kind of 10 times the amount that they've taken over the space of several months. So we are looking for the things. You want to see the pulse rate increasing. You want to see the temperature increasing. And that's not always going to happen straight away. You might just get a little window of somebody feeling better to start with, just having that kind of spark in their brain that, cognition is kind of improving, processing is improving, energy is improving as well. If it's not working straight away, not getting anything, you might actually need to get them back to take it just before breakfast. Some people, if you ever looked at Paul Robinson's thyroid stuff, he often recommends waking up early at like 5 a.m. and taking T3 on its own and then going back to bed. And for some people, that can work really, really well. Some people, it's just not worth waking them up early to get them to take a T3 supplement. Some people would just kind of wake up and do it with food. Now, it depends on uptake and how they're feeling more than anything else. and you might need to experiment with breakfast, without breakfast. You certainly want to look at those markers of the data of temperature and pulse for sure. And I think you certainly want to see how they do with food. If they're getting no responses at all, then you want to look at increasing. I mean, if you're starting to get up to a couple of grains or so and there's no response at all, there's usually something else that might be a cofactor or something. You need to make sure you have plenty of magnesium. You need to make sure you've got plenty of some of the other cofactors. Plenty of sodium, plenty of calcium, all these other factors as well. So it really just does depend, and you'd look at the result based upon their function and then kind of increase if no effect. But again, you get an idea if it's kind of starting to become problematic, because you'd start to see the pulse increasing more than anything else.
And what I've heard traditionally, and I think you're just going to say it independent of the individual, but do you think it's along the right lines that you take more of your T3 throughout the day, sprinkled in throughout the day, and then T4 more at night?
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, I've seen some people do equally well having a tiny drop of T3 at night. I always go back to the heart rate, and if you kind of, I'm digressing slightly here, but reverse or resistance to hypothyroidism, sometimes you'll tend to see this increasing, amount of thyroid hormone, and you don't end up getting much apart from your kind of increased heart rate. That's because the thyroid hormone receptors in the heart, there's a lot of them there, and it's usually the heart rate that ends up going up first. So if people really aren't responding, you could be getting resistance to thyroid hormone, but you'd still see the pulse increasing. And again, that's still a bit of it's not clear with resistance to thyroid hormone what's the best way to go about treating that yet. But to answer your question, which was again, because I've just got sidetracked.
T3 throughout the day and T4 at night, is that?
Yeah, so I think T3 throughout the day, some people just do better on it. And again, it just comes back to, it depends on the person. Because I've seen people do well. I take T3 at night time, or I try to take it kind of early evening by 6 latest. Just as I generally try to find with many supplements that taking supplements later on at night can be counterproductive. Even they're supposed to be sleep-inducing things, with the caveats I'd say with that are kind of your antihistamine, anti-serotonin, things like Cipro and promethazine that do induce sleep. But I've seen people take magnesium and it's keep them awake before, whether they've taken too much or it's just having a stimulatory effect and revving up another part of the system. But again, it makes sense to get a higher dose in the morning, and you'll generally avoid the negative impacts of taking too much if you kind of do the bulk of it during the day. Again, if you take too much and you do go slightly hyper, it is going to keep you awake and it is going to stimulate you. And that's why, if you've done that, there are some things that you can do. Go and have quite a lot of energy, which will lower the thyroid down, or the thyroid response, like the high metabolic rate, because it's always going to be worse when you haven't eaten. Because if you haven't eaten, it's going to ramp your heart rate up even more. It's going to stimulate some of the stress response pathways of breaking down energy. So that's avoiding. But again, to answer your question without answering your question properly, it's like it just depends. But I would agree that taking more T3 earlier on the day is prudent for most people.
And you mentioned briefly the cofactors. There are a ton of cofactors that are necessary for everything in the body, but the thyroid basically ramps everything up. I find one in particular, which you mentioned, magnesium. Just people tend to be deficient in it. It's really hard to get a lot of magnesium in your diet today. Like, is there any cofactors that you're like, hey, you should probably just, like, as a safety bet, might just benefit from taking some magnesium with your thyroid? Or you mentioned thiamine before.
Yeah, I think all of those. I mean, thiamine has some useful add-ons with kind of energy anyway, not just with the thyroid. It's going to support metabolism in the oxidative pathway. So some people can do really well off having extra thiamine. I think selenium is still very relevant. A lot of people think, well, if you're taking thyroid, why do you need more selenium? It's like the deiodinases, the intracellular regulators of thyroid, are selenium dependent. So you will need adequate selenium. I kind of like oysters for stuff like that, and other seafood I think is always really, really good. I've just bringing out sorry to plug this, I don't usually plug anything.
No, plug it.
But a dried oyster powder, just because I have some clients that don't like it, but you can mix it in with food and still get the selenium and zinc and copper that people need. So I think that's a particularly good cofactor. getting enough sodium in, getting enough calcium in, which you should get in your diet anyway, can always be good. Remember, calcium is one of the key regulators of muscle function and action potential. It's one of the few things that you don't have enough calcium and you kind of regulate action potential, it doesn't work properly, but there are studies, if you look at, like, I think Gerald Pollack's and Ling's stuff, who was saying that you could actually remove potassium from the cell and you could still have the action potential as long as there's adequate calcium. So calcium regulation and muscle contraction, I think, is important. So making sure you get good calcium over phosphorus and are there other things that spring to mind? No, that would be the main things. Magnesium, calcium, selenium. There could be other things as well. Anything within that B vitamin pathway, B1, B2, B3, are all things to play around with, particularly when kind of regulating, carbohydrate and dealing with kind of glucose values. That can be a key factor, and there will be various nuances and context for each person that might have them require slightly more.
Awesome, Keith. That was great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure.
Where can everyone find you?
Same place. I haven't been posting much on Instagram. Tom Littlewood still. I've got my website, Balance Body Mind, but unfortunately I'm so wrapped up in the research, I'm hardly posting at the moment unless I get time every now and then, but I try to do something. And
Keith has an awesome supplement company, so especially if you're on the east of the planet, in Britain and Asia, definitely go check that out. That's also at balancebodymind.com, right?
Yeah, very kind for mentioning. Thank you. Yes.
No problem. Well, Keith, I really appreciate your time. You're doing great work, and hopefully we'll see you some more on the social medias soon when you get some more time.